Good afternoon, buenos dias, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair and our indie bookstore partner, Community Bookstore in New Orleans, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Ange Mlinko to discuss her remarkable new collection, Venice Poems, published by our friends at Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Ange Mlinko is the author of several books of poetry, including Distant Mandate and Marvelous Things Overheard. She has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Randall Jarrell Award for Criticism and served as poetry editor for The Nation. Her essays and reviews have been published in The Nation, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, Poetry, and Parnassus. Educated at St. John's College and Brown University, she has lived abroad in Morocco and Lebanon and is currently professor of English at the University of Florida. To moderate this afternoon's program, we're joined by Troy Jollimore, whose poetry collections include Tom Thompson in Purgatory, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Syllabus of Errors, which was chosen by the New York Times as one of the 10 best poetry books of the year. His poems have appeared in The New Yorker, Best American Poetry, McSweeney's, and many other publications. He's a professor of philosophy at California State University in Chico, and as a philosopher, he's the author of the books Love's Vision and On Loyalty. Just a quick reminder that throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and please order your copy of Venice Poems from Books and Books or Community Bookstore and support independent bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So happy to see you both.
Good to be here. I hope we stay here. I hope the tech lets us stay.
I know we've been having some technical difficulty.
So this is nice to meet you. And we haven't really met before. And I know it's not in person, but we're also used to this by now, that it's old hat. Who would have thought?
I know.
So are we going to start with a bit of conversation and then you'll read some? Was that the idea?
Yes, I was told various things that I
Yeah.
could read. I could read first. We could talk a little first.
Yeah,
then,
no, that sounds good. Let's do that, and then we can hear some from the book. It's well, you know what I think of the book because I got to write about it, and it's fascinating. And going back to it, there was so much I wanted to ask. I'm certainly interested in form and your interest in form, which to some degree I think these days is at least perceived as swimming against the current in poetry. I don't know if that's even as true as it used to be, but it feels a bit like I don't know, I don't want to say minority taste. All poetry is a minority taste. So, but you use form in such overt, powerful ways. And I'm curious about, why you're drawn to it, what you think it does for you, or maybe it's not something you even consciously do, but just that's what the poems do of their own right as you're writing them.
I like that thought. I think that there could be several answers to this question, but the truth is that it becomes a collaboration with language when you're using form. So it's not purely self-expression. It doesn't rely on me having a message or actually even knowing where I'm going with it. And so it begins a kind of adventure, and that I go on with the language, or the language becomes a vehicle for something that I'm not sure of yet. And so the materials, add their own intentionality to the poem, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that is what it feels like. And I hear versions of that from so many poets that I've talked to, that the poems never do what they expect them to do or what they try to tell them to do. Or my own experience is, and I've heard this from others too, when I try to make the poem do something, it just doesn't work. I might have intentions or designs on the poem, but those poems always end up kind of dead on the page, the ones that, oh, I'm going to write a love poem, and I do, and it's terrible. There's no life in it.
That's
But
my experience.
yeah, at some point it starts to tell you, no, I want to be a political poem, or I want to be formal, and that's not what you thought, or whatever it is. And you have to follow it, like you said. I think it was when I learned to do that I started to write poems I was okay with to some degree.
I agree completely. You must have read too somewhere, James Merrill said that poems actually made him smarter. Right? Rhyme made him smarter. Rhyme gave him 10 extra IQ points or something like that.
I was actually not familiar with that, and that's wonderful. And I feel like I know what he's saying, because one of the great things about form is that you end up writing things you wouldn't have otherwise, and things you just couldn't have come up with without those constraints. So that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I really find also in a lot of your work, not just the current book, but certainly in this new book, there's so much history in it. Oh,
are you there?
I
can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, odd. Okay. Well, then I'll ask my question then. I didn't realize you could still hear me, even if you can't see me. Odd. There is so much history in the book, and there's so much, it's a simultaneity of historical experience and present experience. I mean, the book is called Venice, and I haven't been to Venice. I have been to Rome a couple times, and I have the experience there, everybody seems to, of being surrounded by history so that you can't avoid it. You turn a corner and there's this amazing ruin. When I read your books, and certainly this new one, I often feel like an archaeologist, sort of excavating all this history, which is sort of popping up all around me. And I guess the effect in a way is reminding me that we're still in history, where history is not something that ended at some point. We live in history. We can't avoid it again. And the experience for me is it's very energetic, this simultaneous experience of the present and the past, which is continuing in the present. And again, I'm sorry, that's not a question. It's, could you comment on that? Is it something, again, you're trying to do? Is it?
Well, Ezra Pound said, all ages are contemporaneous. And I do think I was probably reading a lot of Pound at the time that I was living in Beirut, Lebanon, a dozen years ago, from which my book, Marvelous Things Overheard, eventually emerged. And it was that experience of living in Beirut, which is, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, with layers and layers of old cities built on top of each other, that I really became really convinced of the power of poetry to animate that sense of history. And that language is really uniquely positioned to do that. And so the poetry of the Mediterranean became, very precious to me around this time. Greek, Latin poetry, even Arabic poetry became very important to me. And myths, Greek myths. And it was this, real contact with that history that started me thinking about this. And so it's been an ongoing concern or an ongoing theme for the past 3 books. And with Venice, it became clear that living in the US, and particularly in Florida, which seems like almost a brand new state, I miss it. I miss the sense of deep history around me.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly a very unhistorical country at an unhistorical time in terms of public awareness. Obviously, we are an extremely historical society, like all societies are, but the knowledge of history and the interest in history, the curiosity about it, just seems to be at such a low point in recent years.
Yeah, people say that poetry is esoteric, but history seems to be just as esoteric to people, and it shouldn't be. Obviously, it's a problem. I think we've seen, over the past decade, for instance, or half decade. So I do think it's an urgent matter to excavate. And, I have several poems that even take Florida, as little as there is to excavate. I do try to delve into some of the history or think about it. And there is some interesting history here, which goes back to the 1500s, goes back to, the French and the Spanish warring here and mingling and warring with indigenous peoples and before the English, took it over. So there's a lot here. You just have to pay attention to it.
Yeah, exactly. That is so true everywhere, I think.
Yeah.
Do you want to read a couple poems from the book, or as much as you want, and then we can talk more whenever you feel like it?
Sure. Why don't I, on that note, why don't I begin with the Preparatory Poem, which actually is a memory of visiting Cyprus in 2009. And that was when I was living in Lebanon, and we took a family trip to Cyprus, which of course is the birthplace of Aphrodite, and Venus plays a role in the book. There's a theme, a motif of Venus, and the play on Venice throughout the book. And it also has to do with history and the violence of history. It is almost the new year, almost a new decade, and good riddance to the old one. We go on a whim to a Mycenaean pit that made compost out of a king, his funerary conveyance, and the living horses that drew him. But Famagusta, can you say by what ghost we are detained at the place where the Venetians witnessed the Ottomans flay their commander? It has rained, clover makes handsome reparations, and butterflies called painted ladies are visiting their yellow cups on stalks one by one. Fennel sends up plumes. My kids fill their lungs, stretch their bodies, roll in long grass amid half-hidden rocks, while I wander the dank castle rooms, surfacing on a rampart where the sea is militantly blue, the sun a medallion. A white-cap's surrendering tower, a glitter as of weaponry, rehearse their capacity to stun. Every wave has a will to power. And let me read also this next poem, fast forwarding a decade to the Gates of Hell, which is named after the Rodin sculpture, the Gates of Hell. He didn't mean these kinds of gates, but here we are, or I mean I. On these darkest days of the year, the sun shows that it accommodates our needs and turns itself on high. Show me, sun, what I am doing here. I've been thinking for some time about fallen Caryatid, shouldering her capital. Actually, there were two. The other bore an urn, they made a rhyme. So did Fugit Amor, the enduring nature of attraction to undo. The traveling show, arrayed in a gallery in Savannah, was a gift. Now at the gates of an airport, another Christmas traveler laden with everything that should uplift, I'm trying to be a good sport on my first holiday without my kids. The garbage trucks resume their rounds on roads cellophaned with ice, masticating packaging like chrysalids summarily shaken for sounds or weighed in the hand for the size of the happiness beneath. I steer my thoughts back to the show of misery beyond measurement between gates which bequeath images of angel wings working to slow a fall, not maneuver an ascent. The sun that cufflinks a hill's white sleeve, the plane that bootstraps us to the sky, neither is adequate to the human need, individual to each of us here who leave someone else behind to cry. Cued, with scarcely a line to read. He removed the kiss from the ensemble, surmising correctly that naked bliss was out of place at the gates of hell. If it is bliss that makes us tremble, if it is not also its own abyss between two gates at a terminal. Were you not able to get on the camera again?
I'm trying something now, but it doesn't seem to be. I may just have to persist through this event as a ghostly presence. I had a disembodied voice asking you questions. There's something very creepy about that. I'm sorry. But yeah, it's an odd situation. But again, we become used to these things.
Troy, can I ask you? Here's another disembodied voice. Sorry, it's Christina. Can you toggle, like if you hover above your image the same way? I think you took your own microphone off.
Right. No, that's what I was trying. I can control the mic, but when I hit the video thing, it doesn't come on.
Okay, because it won't let me turn you on either for some reason. So
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Oh. Okay.
Yeah, not to worry. I will. I'll just talk. The voice is the most important part of the poet anyway, you know? I mean, why do poets even have faces, honestly, when it comes down to it? So, and maybe at some point I'll reappear magically, and who knows what will happen, but right now this is fine. I wanted to say about that last poem about the gates of hell, so many things going on in it, and in part it's such a wonderful example, I think, of what I mentioned earlier about simultaneity of history and present day. And you do this very clever metaphorical thing. You know, you have the gates turn out to be two different sets of gates: the Rodin gates of hell and the gates at the airport, which are their own kind of gates of hell that we have all experienced and have, I think, those negative associations with. And you really build on that kind of metaphorical identification in a way that I think enriches the poem. You have, because they're from different historical points, they're embedded in different kinds of life. And they're obviously different in many ways, and yet also perhaps connected to certain anxieties, which are, you know, you hesitate to use the word universal these days, but there's certainly a lot of humans at various times have felt them.
I think in keeping with the, I don't know, the metonym of Venice throughout the book, there was a lot of mirrorings, a lot of doublings. I don't know how much of it was really that conscious or intentional. Sometimes it was accidental, but perhaps nothing is an accident. I think, you know, I think a poem really only comes together for me when there are two things working together or working against each other's counterpoint, maybe, you know, to reach for a musical metaphor. Are you there, Troy?
Oh, yes, sorry. Sorry. Yes, I was waiting for something else. I don't know why. Yeah, I am still here. That's right. Yeah, that counterpoint is the perfect metaphor in a way, or description of what happens in so many poems that, you know, so many Robert Frost poems that I used to be not very interested in because they seemed so simple. And I thought, oh, you know, it's just kind of a folksy rhyming, whatever. And then I became good enough to be good enough for the poems, you know, and I started to see, oh wait, there's the lovely placid surface, and then the strong currents underneath going in another direction that can just suck you right in. And they became suddenly extremely interesting to me. And I think in general, yeah, poems need that tension that comes from, you know, the energy or conflicting energies moving against each other. I think that's right. That's what drives so many really, really strong, really memorable poems.
I think I was always attracted to the metaphysical poets, you know, like Donne and Herbert, who, you know, and I mean, it goes back through the Renaissance, where you always had these double entendres, and you had cross currents and metaphors carried through the entire poem. I think I always wanted to do that, and that's sort of when you get all of this, you know, all of the cylinders firing, don't you think?
Yeah, that's really, it's impossible to read John Donne and not to want to do that. I think, you know, he's so good at it. He will get so much out of what might seem to be a simple conceit. He'll drive it and it'll explode and just unfold into this amazing thing. And it's true. So many of my favorite contemporary poets, you know, Paul Muldoon would be an example who does that.
Yeah.
Right. So much. And is so good at it. He's got such a gift, A, for metaphor, and B, for unfolding metaphorical seeds into, amazing oak trees or whatever it is they become. Yeah, it's so exciting.
Well, when you said before that rhyme is sort of out of fashion or something, I think that sort of also metaphorical readings have seemed out of fashion, as though they were, too difficult or asking too much of a reader. But I think there's a prejudice that a poem has to be journalistic or like journalism, or a very basic kind of reporting, and that really doesn't do justice to what language can do and what poems have done for hundreds of years. And now that we're supposedly so developed, so evolved, I don't understand why poems have to be so devolved.
There really does seem to be this aversion to asking people to work a bit. And, we poems are meant to be accessible in this, what I think is a degraded sense of the term, or inviting. And I think poems should be inviting, but the richer a poem is, and a rich poem is something you do have to work at to some degree, the more it is inviting you to. So I would rather be invited to something that is working on many levels, that's going to give me a lot, as opposed to a journalistic poem that's working on one level that I grasp immediately and, entertains or amuses me or informs me, whatever, but then it's done, it's over.
Even better than the metaphor of work, like making the reader work, I like this turn of phrase that has come up in recent years, that the reader participates in the meaning making of the poem, that you're giving the reader something to do. When they read your poem, they have to complete it by connecting all the dots, right? It shouldn't be work. It shouldn't be work.
Yeah, maybe work has negative connotations, which I don't intend it to have. I think the right kind of work is very, very nourishing, but I like that. That's really great. And maybe this relates to what we were saying earlier about history, which, learning history does feel like work to people. And I think at first it is, because you have no framework. That once you start to develop that, it becomes A, easier, and B, pleasurable. And maybe that's what happens with poems too. But you do need to get to that point where you can see the pleasure or feel it.
Well, related to work, there's also play, and people also, think of it as playful, or maybe even too playful sometimes, when you're punning or rhyming. And people don't usually associate history with playfulness or poetry with playfulness. And that's a mistake too.
It's very sad. In both cases, I think it's very sad that that's where it's come to. And maybe we can do something about that, though I'm not sure just what. Go ahead.
Should I read another poem?
Yeah, please.
Somewhat playful then.
Great.
Venus in Naples.
Great.
And, there are many wonderful museums with wonderful statuary of Venus in various poses, and there are different names given to the Venuses in different poses, but I didn't use them here, but I allude to them. Here, where the various Venuses gather, you know the types. One kind posing with a dolphin or a scallop shell, another gyring to look at her behind, another a more modest bather, crossing her arms. A church bell coincides with the approach of sirens, pitting emergency against eternity, and the sand is cinders and glitter, the source of which everyone can see towering over the environs, the volcano, arch depositor of new earth over old. As if a sapphire beckoned with an aquamarine finger, one wave and the Venus, undoing her sandal, leaps up on the beach of hot clinker, walking barefoot to a blue that will suspire into the sky with a hiss of scandal. As if the sand weren't hot enough, the city's streets are paved with lava flags, and as if a volcano did not suffice, fireworks branch like cave paint stags jumping in brief bursts above the roof, almost nightly, fizzling out in paradise. This is why, given the charcoal black, the heat which comes from below as much as from the sun in July, it's strange that Venus should go where even the butterflies are flack to ask her husband for jewelry. He who made a shield for Achilles might armor his wife with a bangle, but tasting solfatara in her throat, she cannot disentangle invasive owl-infested trees making an opportunistic moat around the stinking fumaroles and the cessation of cicadas. Venus wonders why she's come. The perfume of their fermatas is that of the mute, illegible scrolls charred in Herculaneum. She couldn't say what she envisioned, something machine precisioned, exciting envy, her personal signature, a sacrificial ziggurat in miniature, the thong sandaling a horse bodily, his piece de resistance of theophany. When her husband presents her at last with his gift, a necklace of lava beads, does she laugh or shudder? Oubliette to a necropolis, memento mori, vanity's censure, it says he's in the mud for love. And seeing her expression, he coos, if you don't like this one, I've got another, which I saw like a birth, dear reader, a blood-red moon, forged from either, roughly, the flank of Vesuvius or the heart of the Creator.
Very nice.
That got some of the playfulness and the sort of darkness of creating.
It's doing it all, and I like it. I like the playfulness and the darkness combined. That's one of the things I think that really energizes a lot of these poems. Once again, I feel like I'm almost at risk of beating a dead horse to say this again, but the simultaneity of present and historical experience really came across to me here in these lines. A church bell coincides with the approach of sirens, pitting emergency against eternity. I mean, that really, to me, feels like so much of what's happening in this book condensed into a very small essence. And I think that the use of the word emergency in particular maybe makes me want to ask you something I'd already been considering asking you, which is, I think I detect a note of panic in this book. Is that right?
I wanted to avoid the cliche of the, the end of the world scenario. It is one of, what can you say, for the last 5-7 years, it has felt like everyone is, careening down this roller coaster, shrieking that it's the end of the world. And of course, I'm well aware of everything that's going on, but I don't think that poetry has to share in this sense of high-pitched panic. I think that it actually exists to calm us down and the ancient word measure, the word measure is another word for poetry, because it's metered, because it controls your syllable count, it controls your breath, it controls your pulse. Poetry, I actually think, is an anti-anxiety medication when administered correctly. And so I didn't want to, fall into the sense that you get from the internet and social media that everything is going to hell. Even if it is, I want my book to feel like that it's not really, that life does go on even when there is after apocalypse. The myths teach us this. I do have a translation/version of the myth of Phaeton, right, in the book, which gets tweaked to refer to, instead of Phaeton's chariot, all the cars contributing to all the fires and the heat and global warming and so forth. But this was a story from Ovid, which is even older than Ovid. So the world has been ending again and again and again for thousands of years. So I do think unless an asteroid comes and knocks us off our orbit, it's I take solace in the fact that that we've been here before.
I share that view. Again, it goes back to one of the wonderful things that studying or reading history can do for you, that you realize this apocalyptic fever is nothing new. We've been through it many times. At any time, you can find at least some people in some communities whose lives are devoted to the proposition that the world is about to end and this is the last generation. People just always feel that for some reason. We're the last. And I suppose partly it's because we had such trouble imagining the future that we think, well, everything that could possibly happen has already happened, so we must be the last people, which is absurd.
It is. And it's especially when it comes from older people, it feels like they're projecting their own personal demise onto the entire planet. And so, and I didn't want to fall for that fallacy either. So, Ovid teaches us that the world is a constant metamorphosis, and I take that as I really do take that as a kind of creed, that the world is always in flux and that life is metamorphosis. And that's, that accounts for a lot, and there's no need to panic.
Yeah, I think that's really true. But of course, anxiety. I'm going to quote you, by the way, what you said a minute ago, that poetry is an anti-anxiety medicine, did you say, or treatment? So anyway, it's wonderful, properly administered, as you say, which is right.
Yeah. Anxiety
is real, and I think we can't grapple with it or treat it without acknowledging it. And there certainly is some anxiety in this book. And I wanted to ask about the place of your children in this book. The first two poems you read both mentioned your children, but in both cases, and this is largely typical of the way your children come into this book, it's sort of brief mentions. You acknowledge them, they're there, you make an observation about them, and then move on to the main business of the poem or whatever. But as I read through the book, at least, I feel that they come up often enough in important enough situations that there's a way in which they are very important to the book, although you never quite come out and say, this is a book about my children or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Well, it is on the most basic level, it's the future, right? They're the future. Children are just as poetry might be. Children are our extension into the future. And so for me, there is, I can't believe in an end to the world or a cessation of future because they exist. So in one sense, they serve as the opening into futurity for me. And they certainly, to be able to care for someone, caring for other people, taking the focus off oneself is really important. And, for me too, for poetry, I don't want the focus to be myself. I mean, it comes through me, it's my collaboration with the language, but I don't need to put myself at the center of it. And, the children are a way for me to triangulate my concerns, my feelings with the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes. No, absolutely. I mean, if art does anything for us, it should be a way of taking us out of ourselves and connecting us with larger things. We're already so self-centered by nature.
And the last poem of the book is also about my son playing tennis in an approaching thunderstorm. And, it storms every afternoon during the summer where we are. And so you would never be able to go outdoors or play tennis outdoors in the afternoon if you were terribly worried about lightning all the time. But I remember, this situation where he's out there and there's lightning in the distance and, this is going to have to end. And then at the end, of course, nothing bad happens. And then the sun comes out and it's very beautiful and evening comes and everything is just replenished by the storm. That's probably, now that I'm talking it out, it's probably a recurring theme through, my work since coming to Florida, that storms are this important metaphor for me, that they're frightening, they're risky, they're exciting, they're incredibly exciting, but then they pass through and everything goes back to normal and are even refreshed.
Yeah. You have that wonderful poem in the book too called Hurricane Florence, where you make the hurricane, you talk about the way storms are organized, the way the word gets used there, which is so interesting. And you turn it into kind of a metaphor for making art. And you take this thing which is obviously vast and destructive and frightening, but you find something positive and energizing in it, which I think is really fascinating. I've been going back to that poem a lot. It's very interesting to me.
Should I read them?
Yeah. Why don't you read that one and maybe the last one you were just talking about too, Venice, Florida, if you feel like it.
Okay, two storm poems. It's on 99. Hurricane Florence. Cuban brothel music played while we ate affogato, cold espresso over ice cream. Double-paned windows betrayed a world whipped to and fro as by a double-crossed dream. In the flotsam of my handbag was a double reed for bassoon, difficult, costly, a talisman swimming in the depths I'd drag for loose change, tissues, picayune lists, receipts, hairpins, and fan. I rehearsed the phrase I like. These storms are said to, quote, organize. The way the fitful mind awaits the moment thought will strike and tries on sentences for size till something takes or sates. Incredibly, an intelligence comes to animate the words. When the storm begins rotations counterclockwise, do we sense a formal order it is working towards, even as it wrecks our towns? What I need is a double read of the hurricane. What fagotto, as houses shred to toothpick and no God takes heed and we glut ourselves on avocado, plays such breakup music? Venice, Florida. The clouds went on each afternoon, bodybuilding to a rippling mass, flat-topped or with bedhead. From a puffball, picayune, they did something to the grass fluorescing on the watershed. It rained so hard all summer long, every field was canalized by overflow or turned into lagoon. The fountain jets burped a song of bullfrogs, poolside, bullseyed, prelude to a honeymoon. Electricity's appendages, like butterfly filaments, alit on things, charging the soil with nitrogen, so you'd run as though Nike grabbed your ankles by their wings and you were an Olympian. On one of these afternoons, you met your tennis coach, storms needling the atmosphere, clouds like hydroponic blooms, roots whitening on approach. You should have shown more fear, hitting balls that greenly blazed in the hyacinthine climate. Like statuary, your torso flexed on tiptoe, your arm upraised to execute a serve until the wet match fizzled out. There's a text that warns boys of hubris. Then things would clear. A dragonfly would gondolier through the misted air and seem to offer a golden balance beam to the showboating iris. A calmness floods the aftermath. This is the secret of summer eves when ultramarine bands the earth, twin to the blue hour in the north. Not snowfields, but grass and leaves, dusk milks blue for all they're worth.
Lovely poem and lovely ending. And of course, you make this the last poem in the book. So it's not just the ending of this poem, but it's where you leave the reader at the end of this journey. And with so much of your work, and that's one of the things I really admire about your work, even in a few words, you say many things, or you leave it to the reader to hear many things. So I feel like at the end, this, grass and leaves, dusk milks blue. It's an image of exploitation in a way, which could be a very negative thing, but in the context, it's clearly something very lovely and peaceful after this violence of this storm. And then the last words of the book, for all they're worth, to me, when I hear that, I also hear the common phrase, for what it's worth, which is in a way, sort of an offhanded way to end a poem and a book. And you probably wouldn't have wanted to do that. But there's something right about it, because the phrase, for what it's worth, what does it mean? It's sort of a personal statement. It's an affirmation. Maybe it's not worth a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but in my life, it is worth something. And so I feel like this poem ends on this note of personal affirmation that's very moving to me.
I'm glad. I wanted it to. I wanted to send the reader away with something gentle.
Yeah, it's nice. because there's some tough poems here, or tough moments, maybe I should say. I don't know if there are very many poems that are tough all the way through, but there are tough moments and there are beautiful moments, and it is a real journey. But yeah, it's nice to sort of end up in that place at the end of this. It's a fairly long book. I mean, a lot of poetry books are very short.
I'm so shocked. I'm shocked at how long it is. Yes.
How much planning goes into a book up front? Do you start with an idea what the book will be, or you write poems and then gather them and make a shape?
No, I'm very serendipitous at the beginning. I see where, I just play around for a long time. I'm always on the lookout for rhymes, and not only rhymes as in, lexical rhymes, but rhymes as in thoughts that rhyme, concepts that rhyme, images that rhyme. And so when I have a thought, and it's where I start connecting dots between things, and that's how I get excited and will start a new poem. And then when the poem starts showing some sort of pattern, I get interested in that and see if I can't help it along after that. So I don't start out with, a concept out of nothing, but I slowly, receive, some signs of where the next one will come from. Does that make sense?
Yes. And it sounds, again, very similar to my experience. I have no idea what I'm doing to start. And I often go through a period where I don't write anything, and then a couple poems come and they may give me some clues about what's happening now. And I sort of try to sniff around and follow those clues. And for a while, I'm just writing what feels right. And then at a certain point, I feel like the reasoning that goes into making a poem is similar to the reasoning that goes into making a book, or even parts of a poem. The way a line has to have a pattern that works, and a stanza. You want the book to have some sort of pattern that also works. And at a certain point, you start to see it, but it's sort of obscure, and you put stuff together and then you see where the holes are. And you think, oh, well, if this is the first poem, this is the last poem, but somewhere there needs to be this, and I haven't written that poem yet. And now I'm sort of trying to write the poems that the book needs, but it's very hard. That I think the hardest stage of the process.
Yeah, that's probably the part that takes the longest, isn't it? The part where you're just, you have to be receptive, but you also have to be, synthetic or something. You have to marshal all these things together. Yeah, I find it really difficult.
Yeah, no, I do too. You have to be receptive and assertive at the same time, and that's
it. Yeah.
I've learned to be receptive over the years. It's harder perhaps to be assertive in that way now, but it can happen.
Well, that's one of the dangers of poetry or having it be your identity, is that you constantly feel you have to be coming up with something, but that's exactly what kills the poem, right? Is the forcing your will on the poem is just an absolute disaster. And we've all read lots of poems and whole books that are just dead in the water because the poem.
Oh, on my screen, you are frozen. I don't know if
she's frozen on mine as well.
Okay, so we've lost her for the moment.
No, let's see if she comes back. That's a really beautiful pose there that she's. There we go. Is she coming back? Are you coming back, Angie? Yes.
I.
Ooh.
She's in and out.
Yeah.
I hope we can get her back to read at least one more poem and then questions from the audience.
Absolutely. And let's remind the audience who actually. Ooh. Okay, let's see if she reconnects. Actually, everyone is here because no one has really left the room, which is kind of interesting. So I think this has been a really great conversation. There we go.
Am I back?
You are back.
I could hear you, and I wasn't frozen at all on this end. So
I don't know what's going on today, but I was just telling Troy that everyone that is watching, no one has really left the room. So it's kind of, they've been really transfixed by all of everything, the conversation, the ethereal voices, the freezing in and out. So I just want to remind people watching, please ask a question if you have one. And then I'll let Troy finish by asking you to read a final poem.
Yeah, and I think you should choose. I mean, whatever you haven't read yet that you were hoping you would get to read?
Let's see. I enjoy this poem on page 97. Since I read so many, I read a few Florida poems. This is another Florida poem. It's called Egrets, Herons, Cranes, Ibises. And it's kind of just a pleasure to read. So why don't I finish with that? We don't have much time. What there is of it seems slower because we're engulfed by sun on a wide, flat prairie whose grassy palette conceals so much in its variegation that our gaze takes a while to travel across the vast swath at our feet. Were we to examine it on a swivel, a circle would take an hour to complete, the way the 3-mile loop does. Birders with cameras come from all over to see the species transcend borders for an exotic grub to discover or pond to plunder, fitted at birth, as we are not, with a tiny magnet to help align them with the earth, the latitude, longitude dragnet drawn out on our grade school maps, or else they know how to navigate by stars on their cross-continental trips, as attentive to pattern as to particulars. At any rate, we come for the waterfowl mostly, who come for this water park, hanging out to dry without a towel, or taking to the sky to make no mark. 0 swans, French hens, turtle doves, or partridges here, and mockingbirds, spurning the afflatus of true loves, prefer places with more, not fewer, words. When all falls away to sigh and murmur, a lone Anghinga commands a post. In tux colors, he's conductor, and gestures to the heavenly host, shoulders risen, wings extended. Really, there's something not funny at all, just too human in the unbefriended sounds that issue from the caterwaul. A bleat, a bleep, a honk, a syrinx fissile, deviated, its signal lapsed into wind. Yet each bird, to our eyes so replete a vessel, strains to hear another of its kind.
Lovely poem. Great ending. I love that final line. And the word syrinx, of course, is just one of the great poetic words. It's so good. I sort of want to put it in every poem, which obviously you can't do, but I just love it so much. So I think at this point, probably I should turn things over to the bookstore. And
I have to say that you're such a deep reader, Troy. I'm so glad you're here, even if you didn't make it on visibly. Your questions are really just wonderful. And
I feel like you got the better part of me, so it worked out okay.
The only thing we could do is we could still try to bring you back on if you wanted to try that.
I'm fine to hang out in the ether and listen to the rest.
Okay, so I was just going to say, I don't see any questions coming in yet. If you have them, now is a good time to ask. But I wanted to just maybe ask you, we've been featuring poets all month long at our bookstores. We've been introducing people to poetry. It was really interesting to hear you talk about history and about knowing how to read a poem. And, it's not just history, it's like looking at art. Sometimes you'll go to a museum and people, you'll see it, but you don't see all of the layers. So it is something you acquire a taste for, and you can learn to do better and better so that you can enjoy the experience, because it's such a wonderful experience. So I was just going to ask you, if you could both comment, because we are nearing Indie Bookstore Day, and because it's indie bookstores, putting this on, just if you could comment on what indie bookstores mean to both of you, what bookstores mean to you.
There is no independent bookstore in Gainesville, Florida. And so what it means to me is actually, the absence of one is, has such a disaster for the town. I grew up, a college town was, a bookstore was the sine qua non of a college town. And I live in a college town with a lot of football and no independent bookstores. So if I had one wish, it would be to have one here. And it was formative for me to be able to go to bookstores and to browse on my own. That's how I became a little teenage autodidact, is being able to browse shelves.
Yeah, I have been saying this and fighting this fight for decades now, how important it is to have these physical spaces where people congregate and have conversations, and to have the physical objects to refer to. And I grew up in a very small town, about 3,000 people, where there was really no bookstore. So I had to discover books through family and friends and people who had them, but also the public library. It was in Canada. And so even though it was such a small town, it was a small library, but there were things there that were important discoveries. But when I moved off to go to college and moved to a city where there were real bookstores, I felt that I had entered this other stage of life, and I felt that I was moving forward there. It was so exciting to me. I just wanted to be there, and to hear what people were talking about. And I got so much from that. And so it makes me really sad now to see so many of them going away. I also live in a small city, Chico. We used to have an independent bookstore here. We still have a used bookstore here, and it's a wonderful place, wonderful people, but there's no independent retail bookstore. And it's the soul of a community lies, I think, partly in those places. And it's among so many other things. I think it's a visible sign to people, especially young people growing up and learning what is important and what is valued and just what is visible, that people take these things seriously. People will go and buy books. There's a place to go and get them. If you don't see that on the street, even if you know they're there, they're online, they're in the ether, whatever it is, it's not the same as seeing the place. It's a sign of what we value. And I think right now, sadly, the fact that there are so few of them is a sign that in general, as a country, we don't value this stuff very much. And yet a lot of people are buying books, but they're doing it in invisible ways, and they're trying to get the cheapest, whatever it is. But you divorce the books from the community, and you lose so much of what really makes them important, I think.
Thank you so much, both of you, of course, poets, those beautiful words about bookstores. Thank you for articulating that. For me, one of the pleasures of working at Books and Books is also, like, throughout the years, because I've been there for many years, is seeing different generations, as they, seeing somebody who came to the bookstore as a kid, is now grown up, has gone away to college, is now, has their own practice, whatever, but sharing what it meant to them to actually have a bookstore to come to. So thank you. Thank you both for being with us today, for supporting indie bookstores, for your wonderful work. We love this book. It's really beautiful. It is long.
Well, that's good.
97.
It's a feature, not a bug. It's good.
Exactly. It's so beautiful. And, of course, FSG publishes such beautiful books. I hope that maybe we will see both of you in person one day, not online, not, virtually, but in person. You'll come, maybe you'll come to Miami Book Fair, which happens in November. So let's talk about that. And to all of our viewers and poetry lovers who are watching, thank you for sticking with us. I think it's been a beautiful afternoon, specifically, because of the work and because of all of it. So thank you for making it happen.
Thank you for having me.
Troy,
Yeah,
I'm sorry we can't see you, Troy.
It's fine. It's a Google me. You'll see what I look like. It's fine.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you for all you did today.
Oh, well, likewise. This was really, really fun. I'm glad I got to be part of it.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye, everyone.